Hello and welcome to my channel, Haylee Marie Vintage. I am back after a little bit of a break, although transparently I'm filming this back in December because like I said, taking January off doesn't necessarily give me a break as much as lets me pace out my content. So with that, I am going to jump into this project. I'm really excited. I thought I would kick off the New Year's with sewing one of my favorite fabrics in my stash, which is this really beautiful pink and multicolored kind of sheerish wool that I picked up while I was in New York City last year. I think this fabric is so cute. I love the baby pink. I love the colored little puffs in it. I think it's really cool to find a wool material or like a natural fiber that also is so bright and colorful and fun, because I feel like a lot of times when you're looking at natural materials, they're a little bit less fun than maybe other things. So I'm really excited about this one. I think it's going to be really fun. And with it, I chose a 1930s pattern. So when I go 1930s, I usually have to go reproduction because authentic are pretty expensive, pretty hard to come by, and not necessarily my size. So I'm going with this reproduction one by Lady Marlowe. I am doing, you can't really see it, but I'm doing version, I think it's technically view 2, but I'm doing it with, there's like this long bishop sleeve version that I think will be really cute. And what I like is there's like the tucked, I was gonna say shirt, but this is not a shirt. There's a tucked sleeve that goes into a bishop. I think it'll be a really interesting way to use this fabric, and this is designed to go fairly well with a more sheer knit, so I think it will work pretty well for that. 1930s in general, you often see some sheer knits or laces and things, so I think this will work great for that. First I have to cut out the pattern, so that's what we're gonna hop into before then figuring out any adjustments I might need to make and or cutting out the fabric. So let's hop to it. Since this is a reproduction Lady Marlowe pattern, I do have to cut it out, which is one of my least favorite things. I'm very spoiled by using vintage patterns that are often like die cut and you don't have to cut them at all, and I adore not having to cut them out. So we're just getting through it right now. And then a lot of things need to be cut on folds in a certain way here, so I am just trying to get all of my fabric aligned. This wool is also quite shifty, but yeah, so I am just trying to get all my ducks in a row here. And then of course Spooky has arrived to be annoying, but it's okay because we all love her. But here, yeah, you can see I'm cutting out the skirts on the folds, and then I'll also be doing bodices and things like that. Luckily, this is a directional print in that there are lines and stripes, but it's not directional in the fact that there's a right and wrong way. The colors are haphazard enough that do the pieces the way you need to do the pieces to use the least amount of fabric, which I deeply appreciated. And as always, here's a reminder that I do have a Patreon that you can go over and support me on. You get access to videos 1 week in advance. And then I also have a Ko-fi where you can do a one-time tip or do a monthly membership there. Either are always really appreciated. So far, cutting this went pretty smoothly. Marking it was a little bit tricky because the wool has so many bright colors, so it took some effort there. But overall, this was pretty straightforward and not too bad. And this is not something I normally do, but this is actually going to take quite a bit of finishing prep, so I'm going to go through and zigzag around the edges of every single piece of this because while experimenting with this wool, testing stitches and doing all of that, I discovered that this is really prone to fraying, so I just decided right off the bat, right after cutting them, I wanted to go ahead and do zigzagging around the edges to make sure the edges aren't going to continue to fray and cause problems and be just a pain in the butt. So the fabric prep for this took quite a lot of time. In this video, you'll notice I haven't made any changes in formatting yet. I have been thinking about what I want to do, and I'm thinking of a couple, kind of when I'm hand sewing, doing maybe some chattier things, maybe talking about what content I'm consuming. What you can't see when I sew or hear when I sew is the fact that I am usually consuming media the whole time that I'm sewing. Honestly, really doing most things in life. I consume a terrible amount of podcasts, audiobooks, books, like reading books, TV shows, movies, YouTube videos, like documentaries. I consume a ton of media in general. When I am awake, I am consuming media because it helps me stay inspired, and also like it keeps me motivated while I sew. And even like at my job, since a lot of my job is like moving pixels around, I consume a lot of media. So I've been thinking about like doing little corners of talking about things that I've read or various things that have really resonated with me. So if you're interested in that, let me know. But we're going to continue to move move along. Spooky has joined me during this voiceover in my lap, so you might hear some little spooky purrs. I decided to actually tackle the skirt first. Usually I tackle the bodice first, but this wool fabric was a little bit weird, so I wanted to get used to sewing it in kind of longer, more straightforward seams and less in those kind of more chaotic pleating, tucking, and all the other seams. So I am just working on the skirt here. Here I am pinning the front together where there's kind of two seams down the front that curve. You'll see what I mean in the final product. Up at the top where there's kind of like this V, like big taper thing, I did have to kind of look at the instructions and figure out how this was actually going to seam, just because it felt weird and took a little bit more of my brain power. And the back just uses simple darting techniques, so I'm just using some blue chalk to mark my dart. I didn't use my usual blue pen, which is what I would typically use on this, because I found that the blue pen, the like water soluble pen, just kind of like would get really like lost, and it was really hard to mark with because of the like lack of density in this weave. So yeah, I ended up going with my blue chalk. I found in general this material sewed best with a slightly looser tension than maybe like a standard cotton, but overall, honestly, besides the edges being really fraying prone, this wasn't too weird of a material to work with, which I was relieved by, because I think this material is so cool. But yeah, I thought it was like debatably complicated. And of course I'm pressing everything like usual. I love pressing wool. Wool is one of my favorite fabrics to press. I feel like it just presses beautifully and nicely, and it's just like, there's something extra satisfying about pressing wool more than any other fabric I've ever pressed. In case you're wondering, my top fabric to iron, it's wool. And the seam that I am ironing and enjoying so much right now is the side seams. So after this, I am done with the skirt until I wrap up the bodice. So we're gonna switch gears. This pattern is very puzzle piecey. I do feel like patterns from the 30s are that way. So what I'm doing first is I'm joining just the tiniest bit of shoulder seam from the front bodice to the back bodice. And this tiny little seam will then kind of form the like box shape that the pleated sleeves will eventually be inserted into. And there's gathering right here, right above the bust line. These sleeves insert so interestingly. They're kind of raglan like almost, but this will be like going just kind of like over the top of the bust line, and it'll have little gatherers to be able to take the fullness of a bust. But that's what's happening here. It's a very interesting pattern, and honestly kind of fun to make something really different. And I can take my bodice no further until I tackle the sleeve, so I waited till the next morning to begin tackling the sleeves, because I still find pleating really intimidating. It's so funny because I've been sewing either 4 or 5 years now, and I find pleating terrifying to this day. I always feel like I'm not pleating right. But here I am marking again with that blue chalk, and I am marking down the lines that I did mark the dots with my blue marker, and that worked for dots, but definitely was not going to work for the longer lines themselves. I do feel like this was a little dark in retrospect. I wish I used the yellow because this fabric's so sheer. I could clearly see it, and that is the goal of marking, and the chalk will come out eventually, I think. The pleats for this kind of go out like a sunburst and will give me that really full sleeve, and I've never again worked with a sleeve like this, so this was quite interesting and fun. And with the pleats now marked, I am now pinning those lines together, making sure everything is pretty aligned and neat. I think I'm bad at pleating, or think of myself as bad as pleating, because pleating is a very like tidy type of sewing, and I know I'm very like intentional about the way I sew, but I'm like still chaotic enough that pleats are kind of tough. And with that all marked and then pinned, I am now sewing down the pleats. Nothing exceptional here. I am ending the pleat with a zigzag finish. Like that's just like back stitching, like back stitching and then forward stitching. I've definitely read, heard, seen that you're supposed to not do this and you're supposed to tie the edge of pleats, but I don't see a difference when I do this, and it's more convenient, so that is what I'm gonna do. And then the instructions have you iron the pleats down all facing the same way. I believe it is towards the back, but I am not 100% sure. I don't quite recall. And then like I said, this is basically kind of like a rectangle or a polygon or whatever. So what I'm first doing is I'm sewing the sleeve to the like top of the sleeve head, and I chose to do this, not all the instructions technically have you do it all at once, but I know that I'm not good enough at pivoting to do that, so I'm doing this first seam and then I'll show you what I do from here. So now that I have that first seam sewn from dot to dot up at the top, I am then now clipping the corner like it requested to, and then I'm going to pin the like side of the sleeve seam to the bust or it's like a diagonal of the sleeve seam to the bust, and I'll do it on the other side too. And this just like helps me not have to pivot. It helps me like decrease my chances of weird creases, well as potentially over clipping this. So that is why I like to do kind of those more like things that I feel like are in vintage patterns that show you as being really easy to just like pivot around. And I've just learned for me, it's not that easy to pivot around, and doing this method works better for me. This is also where the gathering along the bust line comes in. And here I am pressing all of those weird seams, making sure everything's going in the right direction. And this leaves me with basically just 2 side seams that are open, the sleeve all the way to the waist. So hopefully that helps you put your picture in place of how this is kind of like a raglan sleeve. And here I am pinning that kind of raglan, batwing, whatever you want to call it, sleeve to prepare it to sew all the way from the waist up through the wrist of the sleeve essentially. And with the bodice mostly wrapped up, I am going to put in the gathers I need to eventually attach it to the skirt. There's pretty heavy gathering, and I believe both the front and the back. Before I can attach the bodice to the skirt, I do want to wrap up a few things like the facing for the neckline. Facings like this always scare me because I'm essentially going to put a cut into them eventually, and that is very intimidating. So first thing I am doing is I am just pinning the facing, making sure everything aligns, but then I'm going to have to figure out that line that I'm eventually going to be cutting the facing down, which is scary. So I am putting some pins in to mark that. And then once I am satisfied, I will mark the official line. This time I did use this pen because it was only 1 line and wouldn't be as frustrating. I remembered exactly why I wasn't using this pen though, because it does snag, which is not my fave. I did end up needing to use the blue chalk because I couldn't quite see the very ends of this because I needed to angle it so it would be the slit it should be. So I did mark it with chalk, and you can see there it's 1/4 inches from the main line that I marked. So that was the method to this madness. It is also technically slightly off grain, which I just decided I could live with because I think if I cut it on grain it would have been crooked. So I guess I cut this whole piece a little bit off grain, which is not surprising because this fabric is not the like most sturdy type of fabric. Before I could sew that, I had to pay the headbutt tax from Spooky. Spooky was in intense headbutting mode today. She just wanted to sit everywhere and headbutt me again and again and again. But once I paid the tax, I was able to get back to sewing this neckline. As you can see, Spooky's still lurking and headbutting, but I'm just ignoring it. What you can't see super clearly because it's too far away and there's too much fabric is I got down to the end, and then to turn around I like to do 1 stitch like perpendicular from the line and then go back up. I find if I do a really sharp turn there instead, when I cut down the line, it's going to eventually make me cut the stitches, and you also need like the tiniest bit of width there for it to turn out and look okay. So that is what I did. I forgot to show the scariest part, which is cutting that line down the facing. I accidentally did that off camera, but here I am ironing this down. I also did do an understitch to make sure this presses as nice as possible and to hopefully help with any of those frayed edges from where I cut. I will say I did notice that I was still having problems here, especially at the very end. The frayed edges kept fraying and caused some pulls down at the very V part of that neckline, so I had to go in and kind of like hand darn sew rig the whole situation. If I was to use this fabric in the future and do this with this fabric in the future, I would go back and zigzag those seams before I did anything else, but you live and you learn. I also then made sure to mark where my buttonholes were going to end up, making sure everything looked straight and correct. I always feel like these necklines are kind of tricky to keep everything from not going kind of skewed and sideways. So this was my effort to not do that, but I still think one of my buttonholes was skewed and sideways anyway. I then needed some bias tape to finish the ends of my sleeves. I was originally going to do a bias tape out of a cotton, but I realized it would be visible and it would bother me that the texture was different than the rest of the fabric. So instead I started to cut bias tape out of this, which was a choice. It worked really well. I'm happy I did it, but it was a choice. That's for sure. And then I've tried sewing this a few ways. I know Spooky was in the way here. First time I did this, I first started by just sewing the bias tape like normal. So I am sewing down and around. I also moved Spooky because her tail hanging over like that made me nervous. I realized I accidentally still had it on the zigzag, which was not what I wanted. But now we'll sew it for real. And I am just sewing, I think like a 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way around. And this is right side to right side. I am then understitching because I will always say that I think understitching gives you a cleaner finish at the end. Even though I didn't use a different type of fabric for the bias tape, I still wanted this to be neat and tidy. What I don't show you here that didn't work for me is I then had to turn it all the way over and turn that top edge over just a little bit more, and because of the fraying, that was incredibly frustrating. So for the second sleeve, I first started by giving myself a clean edge to have my bias tape eventually, like, this will be the edge that I sew down around the way the pattern instructs. But here, this really helped me not be as frustrated as I was on the last sleeve. So yeah, I always do one sleeve all the way through before doing my next sleeve, because I might learn things while doing that first sleeve that is going to make my second sleeve better. Even though then they are technically not exactly matching, I would prefer to have one meh sleeve and one really, really nicely done sleeve than two meh sleeves. So all kind of depends on your philosophy there. I then am sewing again. I am doing again that 3/8 seam allowance, and this is my bias tape to the edge of the sleeve, right sides together again. And then after understitching, I am trimming out some of this seam allowance. I just think that will help the elastic. I also think this will be frayy and annoying and kind of a nightmare. And since I did a seam and then an understitch, I think that all my frayed edges will be contained enough that this will be okay for long-term wear and won't hopefully create more holes, because that would be the other concern. But since I have 2 lines of stitching there, I'm feeling pretty okay that that will not happen. And then once I'm done, I'm just top stitching around. I will say this was hands down the correct decision, even though it felt kind of weird to make this decision to do this sleeve so radically different. I was so much less frustrated here. When I was doing the other sleeve, I was trying to get myself like a clean edge before doing anything else, while it was also attached to the sleeve, and this was such a pain in the butt. Since I did that here, it's less of a pain. You'll see that I'm not sewing up to the edge of my bias. I'm instead favoring keeping an even line. This is often how I do these. You know, I could just make a even tape, but somehow I am incapable of that. So instead, I take my uneven tape and just make sure I stitch it on evenly, even if that means I have some weird edges in there. I think for this it'll be fine. I will say for like, if it was a contrasted bias tape, it would not work, but because it's the same fabric as the fabric, I think it turned out okay. And with all that done, I am now going to sew the top to the skirt. I'm matching all of my seams, notches, markings, all that good stuff, putting in the gathers. I will also say this fabric was not my favorite when it came to gathering. I felt like it was kind of chunky. I found both here and on the bust having to redo the gathering about like 6 or 7 times to make it look right. I think that is my own poor choice of fabric, I guess, and not the pattern itself's fault. But yeah, this definitely took some finagling and kind of more like hand gather placement situation to get it to lay the way I wanted it to lay. But with that done, I went ahead and I started to put my zipper the way I normally do. I'm giving you some spooky footage here, but ultimately I completely messed up here. I could tell I messed up about 2/3 through the zipper, so I put it down from the night and decided I was going to revisit it the next morning because I was frustrated and I could tell I wasn't going to make any positive progress on this project if I didn't just take the break and put it down. One of the few biggest things I've learned to sew is when you're frustrated, put it down, stop working on it. It's not worth it to like persevere through being really frustrated. This is a hobby. This is something we do for fun. When you're frustrated, it's best to just like get up and walk away for a little. All right, I've slept. I feel better. I am ready to tackle the zipper of this again, and I think one of the problems with this fabric is it's not even necessarily like stretchy, it's such a loose weave, it's a little bit challenging to work with. So I decided I think I need some stabilizing in my zipper. This is a trick I used a lot when I was earlier in my sewing, and I just needed that extra help with my zipper. So if you're finding frustration with your zippers, I do recommend trying this interfacing tape for zippers. So this just gives you a 1/4 inch of like really, really sturdy, crisp edge to work with when you put in a zipper. So I'm putting that in right now. It's like a double-sided interfacing tape, and this is something that really helped me get better at zippers, and that is actually like a training wheel I essentially took off once I got good enough at zippers that I didn't feel like I needed that extra stabilization. But here I needed that extra stabilization, so I'm sticking it in, and I am trying to remember this is a tool I have in my box when I work with kind of finicky fabrics. I also decided to use a slightly different zipper technique. Usually I start at the top, go all the way down and around and all the way back up. I am going back to basics here. I am starting at the bottom on one side, going all the way up. and then I'll start at the bottom on the other side and go all the way up. And this just helps you match things better. It helps across the board. It's just a much like slower and less efficient way to put in a zipper, but it is an easier way to put in a zipper than to me to go all the way down and around, especially again with such a like kind of shifty, weird fabric. So that is the method I used here. Definitely, like, even when you become a better sewer, it's okay to go back to techniques that were kind of, like I said, training wheels for yourself, because sometimes those training wheels are the right choice for a really like super more complex fabric. And like, to be clear, I really went back to basics here. I even did so much as to pin the complete length of the other side of the zipper. This is something I have not done in years. I've felt good enough about zippers for a long time to not feel the need to do this, but I just was like, I would rather take an hour and a half, which is what it took for me to put this in so intentionally, and put it in again right, than have what happened last night happen, especially because this fabric is pretty delicate and can't take a ton of unpicking. If this was a canvas, this might have been a different story, but because of the fabric this was, I was like, I'm just going to take this really slow and really beginner friendly. And honestly, I ended up with a really, really successful zipper. So it was really worth taking the time to do that. With the zipper in, I can now focus on other details like putting in the elastic. There's a lot of fancy tools out there that you can use to thread elastic through. There's lots of bodkins and different things. And to be transparent, I own most of these things, but I still think the best thing to use is a safety pin, which is what I'm using to thread it through here. And then I'm just using a zigzag stitch here to secure the elastics together, making sure also that I didn't accidentally flip any elastic, so I won't have any flippy elastic in my thing. That is something that can happen and is quite frustrating. And I think this is the first time on my channel all of my braces are making their debut. All of these splints, silver splints on my fingers and thumbs, and you've seen my bigger braces for my thumbs on here before, but I'm using these to hand sew. It does make things a little bit more clunky in ways, but my hands don't ache and like shoot pain anymore, so we love that, even though they are a little bit clunky and I still feel like I'm adjusting my gripping of my needle. The other thing I've noticed since I started using these braces is I never understood how thimbles were used, and now I realize it's because my fingers were so far out of alignment compared to like a normal person's fingers. Using a thimble was like bulky and weird for me. I wasn't using a thimble for this project because this fabric was so easy to push through. I didn't need a thimble, but all of a sudden some of my hand sewing methods that are less orthodox make a ton of sense. It's because literally my fingers were not aligning. So you learn something new all the time. Now I understand thimble use, so that's pretty cool. Here I am now adding in all of my buttonholes, following the lines. I have chosen buttons, and I think in retrospect these buttonholes are maybe the tiniest bit too big for the button. It's always really hard when you have a really high profile domed button. It's fine because they like blend in enough that it's okay. And I thought stitching a buttonhole on this fabric was going to be super weird and I would have to try a lot of different stuff with tension, but it ended up being just as straightforward as usual. However, I will also note that my buttonhole stitch and buttonhole foot has a plate underneath to really keep the fabric moving together. I do think if it didn't have that plate underneath, it would have been a little bit of a different story. But now I'm getting really close, and I am getting close to hemming this, which means I am putting in my usual basting stitches that will help me gather and ease like the hem in when I go to fold it up, because I know I will be shortening this by probably quite a bit. But once I have that length chosen, I can just kind of pull those threads and get a nice even gather, I guess, of the easing stitches that I put in. This is my most tried and true method for hemming a like curved skirt. There are tons of other methods out there. This is what works best for me, but go try all the methods and figure out where it works best for you, because I think everybody's brain and like skills just work a little bit different. The last thing I wanted to tackle is I wanted to make a belt using all of this belting I have in my stash. When I first started sewing, for some reason thought I needed belting. I bought a whole ton of it. I bought so much belting and I've never used it, and so I was like, this is a great time to learn to use this belting because this fabric is so flimsy. It's going to need like the sturdiest backing possible. This ended up a disaster. I'll show you the actual belt that came of it at the end, but I gave up. I was kind of filming, kind of not, when I gave up. But this first bit went okay, but then once I actually started stitching it, it started fraying and it started moving and it started shifting, and all of a sudden I had a really, really sloppy looking belt. So I did ultimately give up on this dream and I bought a belt on Etsy. It's a nice, cute little vintage belt, so it's fine. But yes, this was a struggle and a choice. I'm going to try to use this belting this year. I want to try to figure out how to use it properly, but this was not the fabric to do so. But with the belting done, it is back to the hand sewing. I'm going around and doing the hem here. This fabric was so easy to hand sew because it's such a loose weave that I just picking up a couple threads and doing like a really invisible hem was super easy, which I was very happy with. And the last instruction on the pattern is to make the 2 buttons with the string in between, so that way it keeps the gap closed. That's why I put in the buttonholes and all of that. Of course, it failed to tell you exactly how to make your buttons string together, so I went with a method that you make the string the length you want, you go back and forth a couple times to like bulk it up, and then you do basically like a buttonhole or a blanket stitch over and over again to wrap all that thread together. So that's what you see me doing here. I don't know if it was like exactly right. I mean, the other option that I've seen and more typically seen is chain in between the 2 of these. I just know that chain is going to be a sensory issue and also more likely to cause some sort of flare-up of eczema on my chest. So I'm going the thread loop option. That is going to be most successful for me. That's the last thing I had to do for this project. I'm just waiting for the belt to come in and then we will hop to the reveal. All right, we have made it to the reveal, obviously past the reveal. We're now headed for 3 things. I usually only do 2, but we're doing 3 today because I'm back for the first time in a month. First, I'll take you through my regular cost breakdown. I'll talk to you about my final thoughts on the project. And then last, I'll talk to you about how my break was. We will move straight into cost breakdown. My lighting is actually good today. We have made it past the darkest days of the year. It's now getting better again. For cost breakdown, this fabric was expensive. I mean, it is wool, which I still can't believe I found a wool this fun and colorful because like I said, I think wool is infamously not very fun. But because it was wool and it was like specialty, it was expensive. So I spent $139.80 on this fabric. For notions were cheap because I just needed buttons, thread, a zipper, and a label. That's all I needed. So I only spent $6.66 on notions because I zigzagged. I didn't have any extra trimmings, so very affordable notions wise. And then the pattern, Lady Marlowe's palettards are just expensive, honestly. So I spent $25.79 on this guy, but I do think I'll use it again, so I think I will get some good mileage out of it. For just my dress, I made this for $172.25. Pretty okay. I've been thinking a lot about consumerism and things and like clothing, and like when I make something like this, I feel like when I'm saying I'm spending $172.25, I'm ultimately comparing it more to like, I think designer or like higher end prices than I am to like fast fashion, right? I couldn't find anything in fast fashion that was really anything close to this. So I'm not going to take you through all those steps like I do usually. I will bring that back though, but I just didn't have It's pretty hard to find 1930s silhouettes in modern wear, so I wasn't able to hunt those up. But like, when I think of like the conversations about sewing being really expensive, I think you need to like sewing is really expensive compared to what? Sewing is really expensive compared to fast fashion. True. Not all the time, not if you can find your material secondhand, but it is going to ultimately be more expensive than if you did a fast fashion piece, if you bought a fast fashion piece. However, this is cheaper than if I had found a slow fashion brand that produced a fun wool and a thing like this. And this was certainly cheaper than if I was to go Chanel, Dior, or I mean, those are like thousands and thousands of dollars, but even if you scale it back to, there's plenty of, they're like considered mid-range fashion designers, even though they're very expensive, but there's plenty of brands out there selling dresses for like $400 that are still polyester. I think one of the things I'm thinking about mindset wise is like when somebody talks about something being more expensive than somebody else, like being really clear on like what we're talking about. Like, are we talking about sewing being expensive compared to exploiting people in the global south who are usually women of color to make cheap garments for you? Or are we talking about like a sustainable brand, right? I don't know. Hopefully that all made sense to you. I feel like I lost the thread at the end, but I've just been thinking a lot about, when we talk about something being expensive or cheap, comparing it to what and conditions and things like that is also really important. And on that topic, we do talk about labor, of course, here on this channel and how long it takes for me to make things. This took me 10 hours to make. It took me 2 hours to cut it out, 6 hours to do all the machine sewing, and 2 hours to do the hand sewing. So grand total of 10 hours. And then here on this channel, we talk about a living wage. I know for a fact I need to adjust my living wage here because this is from 2024, which means the reports from 2023 ironically will hopefully be out soon, so I can adjust this. I'm going back and forth because again, I think this does, with some adjustment, give you a living wage, but it doesn't necessarily give you like a comfortable wage, and I just like go back and forth on what that all even means. So if you have any good studies for living wage in Seattle or in US or even worldwide, let me know, link them to me, because I would love to use this as resources to calculate hourly rates. Right now, according to data from I think 2023, the living wage in Seattle is $35.39, so I am multiplying that by 10, where you get a labor cost of $353.90. So you get to a grand total of $526.15. Of course, that's not what I paid. I don't consider that to be my cost for this garment, but I think it is foolish to talk about crafted and homemade goods without talking about labor and time and all of that good stuff, which I'm happy to do it for myself. But like, if you're starting to talk about selling clothing for a business, you are not just doing it for yourself. You're not just doing it for joy. You need to make a profit. You need to pay yourself a living wage or your workers living wage, and all of that has to be thought of when we think about the cost of clothes. But I do have the dress here. Here she is. I feel like, I don't know if I've just gotten to a point that when I get to the end of every project, I don't like it that much until it's been like 3 weeks and then I really like it. But that is how it worked on this project. I did say I was going to show you guys the really ugly attempt at a belt I made. But it's like funny because now that I've had some distance for it, I'm like, maybe that doesn't look so bad. But it does. It does not look great. Now I'm like, maybe I could have made it work. But no, it would have been a not very good touch on what was a really expensive project. But I'm glad I tried it. I won't do it this way again, or I won't do it with such shifty fabric. And sometimes you try something and it doesn't work, and I want to show you that that happens to me. I feel like people think I'm like a really, really great seamstress, and I will say I am a decent seamstress, but there's still lots of things that I'm guessing and trying and experimenting and failing on. But this dress did come out really well. Definitely zigzag stitching all the edges was the right call. I'm so glad I bought this fabric. I was on the fence about it because it's kind of weird, but it does feel, I feel really beautiful in this dress, and it's very fun, so I'm really happy with it. New skills, I don't know that I feel like I super learned anything else. I feel like what I'm learning right now is just how to try new silhouettes while making sure it'll still be something I like. This is like quote unquote a newer silhouette for me. Most of the 1930s gowns I've made have been formal out of like silk or taffetas or things that are like really formal, and I feel like wearing a formal silhouette is really different than a day-to-day silhouette, and I'm pretty proud of myself for trying a different silhouette for myself. I know it's still big sleeves and whatever, but I like to say the 1930s are really like tall, long, and lean, and I am not. I am short and curvy. This was just a good reminder that like your body type doesn't matter that much. If you actually sew something that fits you, silhouettes will like transform things, because like I do say I feel long and tall and lean on this, even though my body obviously doesn't change when I wear it. I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I tried it. I will say this is sometimes a little intensely modest for me. I will probably probably try wearing it without the buttons in. But yeah, it is still really colorful and fun, and I do feel really nice in it. And also it's like nice and warm. We are in such a like deep cold spell in Seattle. I'm gonna have a fortune of a heat bill at the end of this, because this year I'm accepting that I need to be at a certain temperature to not have searing pain. So to keep it warm enough in my apartment despite how cold it is outside has been a little bit tricky. But how my January off has gone, so it is January 24th when I'm filming, so I think we're 2 weeks from when this video releases. It's been really good. This is the only project I've completed in that amount of time on camera, but off camera I think I've completed like 7 garments or something wild like that. I really feel like I have my like sojo back and a lot of desire to create. I think this new schedule is helping. I just feel less pressure overall, and I think taking the month off was really, really great. That said, obviously this week has been crappy. Terrible. Like between the political theater of the TikTok ban, again, you're gonna see this 2 weeks later, so all of this is gonna feel so long ago. And I'm sure we're gonna have a new batch of challenges, but like, yeah, with the political theater of the TikTok ban, that really turned me off. I like feel like I can't even enjoy TikTok anymore because of the way all of that went down. Obviously like the inauguration, the 40 or whatever executive orders and stuff that were released. I've been like keeping on top of it, but also trying to keep rooted and grounded in my community. And not even like I know that these are tactics. The tactics of a 40 like executive orders is a tactic to overwhelm people and make them give up. So I'm trying to like wade through what's real, what like actually has actions that I can take, and connecting with my community, whether that's my queer community, whether it's my sewing community, and just really centering on like community building, things that give me joy, stuff like that, and not letting overwhelm and fear, and like staying focused. Like I've read a lot about like making sure that like you do what you're good at and what you're meant to do in times like this, and like it's not your job to do everything. And I've been trying to like again keep myself really focused, keep this channel really focused about advocating for queer people, for garment workers, just trying not to like collapse my own world in like the kind of stress and things, and like keeping my world broad and keeping it focused at the same time, which I feel like broad and focused are kind of not the same, or like not stickable together. But I don't know, I feel like this is probably not that helpful. It's just I don't feel like I don't have the answers. We are all dealing with this in our own way, and so I'm trying to speak a little bit more into how I'm dealing with it. And I'm dealing with it on choosing on, again, staying focused, staying rooted in my community. I had 2 great community things over the past few weeks. I hosted my first mending circle, and no, I'm not gonna cry. So I don't do this on the channel all that often because I don't talk to you guys like super blatantly about like myself or my life, but I'm a huge crier. Like I cry probably once a day, and I don't consider a day worth it unless I've cried, because I cry when I'm happy, I cry when I'm sad, I cry when I'm bad. Like that's just like how my emotions come in. But like I just feel so deeply appreciative of the community I have, and first mending circle, like getting to teach people like the joy of mending their clothing has meant a lot to me. It was a really, really fun event. I felt really connected back into my community. It made me realize that like I hadn't let things go as much as I had in the past 4 years when it comes to my community, because people showed up, people learned, people taught, people connected, and that was really what I wanted, keeping it together. And then for my sewing retreat, going somewhere later, and I need to not smear my makeup, but I just feel so loved right now, and I feel so grounded in community. And I'm also just raw because it's been a tough week in my community. I've had friends get married because they're scared, and at the same time of having friends get married because they're scared, Thailand has legalized same-sex marriage, so I'm also seeing all these really beautiful couples get married, and like just have a lot of feelings right now. And one of them is feeling loved, and a lot is also just feeling really overwhelmed. But like I'm just, for the retreat, like it was so great to spend time with 9 other people who are really passionate about sewing. And it was nice because the whole saga of the TikTok ban happened while I was on the retreat, so I had people to talk about it and like feel feelings about it with, and just like there's just, which I say all the time here, there's just so much power in community and like talking, and you don't even all have to like agree. Like they're just, I mean, you have to agree on certain things, right? Like I have to be around people who believe I have a right to exist, but like community is just so powerful, and it's so powerful and grounding, and like helping you realize that like there is good. And I think the next 4 years, we need to really be practicing our there is good mentalities. Of course, not turning a blind eye to the bad, but not letting us become without hope I think hope is going to be really key. And let's see what else has been going on while I've been off. Yeah, I've sewn a ton. I've spent a lot of time with people. I'm a little over socialized right now. I think I've been having the goal of socializing like a couple times a week outside of my normal. I have like my group that I meet with once a week and have been for a really long time, and for a long time that's been my only social. So my goal has been to do 2 things on top of that, which I think works when I haven't just had a 3-4 day long retreat where I was around people 24/7. So I think next week I'm gonna hermit a bit and really enjoy that. I've been tackling a lot of medical stuff. I've been trying to just get all my medical appointments kind of figured out for the year, all my maintenance, so that way when the stuff comes up for my other health, I can just tackle that as it comes and not have to also figure out how to manage all my maintenance, like stuff like dental, eyes, stuff like that. I'm feeling really sad, but I'm feeling really hopeful all at the same time. I would just encourage you guys not to despair. There is good. Be the good. I don't know, just like don't lose hope and be the good that you want to see. Do the best that you can. And like, we're gonna hunker through. We're gonna one of the things I've been reminding myself, and it's not to invalidate our experience, of course, but like I'm trying to remind myself that people have had joy in worse, and that it's okay to have joy. Like when you read different times that authoritarian leadership have come into power and have come into play, there's so many different things about like organization and community and things like that like have happened over the years and make me feel really hopeful. I'm planning on, it's been a historic deep dive I've been meaning to dive into for a while, but I've been meaning to dive a bit into the Polish resistance during the Nazi regime. So that is a hyper focus I plan on going in on. And then I believe it was in Denmark that there was also a really, really successful underground group that saved a lot of lives. So I'm just, right now, I feel like my focus is grounding in community and learning a lot about the people who have been through this before. This isn't new. This isn't the first time. I mean, it's a little bit different because we have things like TikTok and social media and stuff like that. But like, yeah, this is not a new thing. And in some ways that's depressing, in other ways it's comforting. So yeah, I plan on reading a lot, learning a lot from our predecessors and our people who have been through this. There's tons of people on this planet right now who have been through this before, and just kind of taking comfort in that. I'm just gonna wrap us up because I felt like this was a lot of little side quests. My brain is kind of all over the place right now. I feel like I don't have to explain. It's been a week. It's been a lot. I've been hearing a lot of things from a lot of different people. I'm staying focused, staying hopeful, and staying here. I am, again, so glad I took my break. I'm so glad. I'm just so thankful for everything, which sounds very strange given the time and place I'm in. Today, obviously, you saw this video, and then next week I am going to bring you a Seattle spring vlog. I took a ton of footage last Seattle spring, and I never got around to putting it together in a video for you guys, so I figured I would take us out of this winter doldrum space, talk about spring, hope, renewal. I mean, I'm just showing you spring things. I'm not talking about all those things in that video. It's gonna be just like a very chill, hopefully very beautiful video for you guys. And then I will be back with a sewing project. And then after that, I'll have a week off. TBD on right now, I would like that sewing project to be another coat, but I'm also feeling like I need to rest. So I'm going back and forth on whether I'm gonna convert that to a dress and do the coat a few weeks later. So we'll see where I land on that, but there will be a coat or some other sewing project. So stay tuned. Definitely subscribe and stick around. If this is your first time here, I would love to have you. And then as always, I have both my Patreon and my Ko-fi. As always, give this a thumbs up, comment down below. Let me know, what are you reading? What is giving you comfort in these times? Where are you learning? Where are you finding hope and community? And yeah, I will see you in my video next week. Toodaloo!